Hey everybody, welcome back to Up the Vibe, and today I'm joined by Rob Neyland, who is both a sculptor for the last 40 years and also a researcher who has published papers with the previous guest, Manu Seyfzadeh, and also with the likes of Robert Schoch and Robert Bauval looking closely at the Sphinx in Egypt. How are you today, Rob?
Excellent, excellent. Greetings, Joe, and greetings to all of your listeners around the world, and especially to our friends in the UK. From snowy Breckenridge, Colorado, lovely ski town here in the Colorado Rockies. And I know that it is a favorite of many, many visitors from the UK, many of whom perhaps are familiar with the International Snow Sculpting Championships that occurs each year
Mhm.
here in Breckenridge. I'm a part of that story, and
Yes.
that's a part of this story that we're going to be looking into today.
Yeah, of course. So let's start actually, before we go into the Sphinx, about your history in sculpting, how you got into it, and what you've achieved in that area and mastery.
Well, it's a funny story, but I have been for the last 40 years um, competing internationally and in snow sculpting as a snow sculpture artist. And I've been captain of the United States team and have traveled all over the world for the last 40 years and have won the gold medal on 3 continents during that period of time. And this bizarre activity involves the subtractive sculpture of monumental pieces of monumental size using only hand tools in competition. So it's in a very, very compressed time frame. Literally, a competition lasts about 4 days, and we'll take a block of snow, a block, if you will, that is a very dense and brittle medium, and we will render a fabulous sculpture in a matter of 4 days. And so it is that sculpturing ability, if you will, that sort of led me on my strange journey with Mehit, aka the Great Sphinx
Mhm.
of Giza.
Yeah. So you've been
So,
sculpting for 40 years, and how did you start in that? And is it was it a passion that came from building snowmen and playing around, or was there more to
yes,
it than
yes, it
that?
is. It was a passion that came from that. And, I have a background in advertising and design.
Mm.
And so that sort of led me on this path. And the neat thing about snow art is that it gives the artist, the sculpture, if you will, um, it gives them the opportunity to actually do their own ideas rent large. Normally you don't get the commission to do a giant monumental sized snow sculpture until you're one of the very famous sculptors in the world, and a city commissions you or a corporation or something like
Mhm.
that. The ability to do your own ideas and to execute them on the public forum, on the public stage, if you will, in snow is really a wondrous thing about this particular art form. And I have to tell you that there is a exquisite irony in the fact of a practitioner of what is the most fleeting form of sculpture should be drawn to researching the most ancient and enduring and colossal sculpture on the planet, that being the Great Sphinx of Giza.
Yeah. So you've had a history with that. How did you get involved with discovering more about the Sphinx?
Well, coming to this from the perspective of a sculptor, and again, I would stress, I'm a sculptor. I am not a geologist. I'm not an Egyptologist. I'm not an archaeologist. I'm a sculptor. And to me, I am keenly aware of the power and purpose of symbols as vehicles for knowledge and understanding. So, as an avid student of ancient civilizations, I was drawn to the work of Robert Schoch. And 30 years ago, John Anthony West and Robert Schoch asserted that the Great Sphinx of Giza was actually far older than we are told, and that the head had been recarved in dynastic times. Well, since 2017, we have known that this recarved head had originally been a lioness, and that lioness we have ascertained, was the ancient dynastic goddess Mehit, who was the patron of the scribes and the priesthood and the archivists in dynastic Egypt. Since 2019, we've known that that head reached its current appearance when it was recarved by Khafre or someone of his time frame about 2500 BC, 2550 BC is when it was carved out. So I took all of this and came to the table with the notion that, okay, if John Anthony West is correct, and if Robert Schoch and Robert Bauval and Manu Seyfzadeh are correct, that the Sphinx is older, and the reason that it looks like an Egyptian is because the head was recarved down from that of a lioness. If all of those things are true, then as a sculptor, that's how I approached this question. If all of those assertions are true, then it means that the head that we see today on the Great Sphinx must have been able to have been derived from the stone head of a lioness on the former sculpture, period. Because in stone, you can't add stuff back on, right? So anything that has been seen throughout the history of the Great Sphinx, which, just as a side note, the head that we see today is not the way the Sphinx has looked forever. It's not as the way the Sphinx has even looked during the time of its current head. It also had other elements that were present during history that are no longer present, i.e., you know, the royal headdress had the breast lappets that came down the side here. It had the royal divine beard off the chin. It had the Nemus tail back behind the side of the headdress there. And of course, as we might also note, it also had a nose. Okay, so the point being that all of these elements had to be able to be arrived at by sculpting a lioness head. That's where I came to this question in the first place. And so I set about to perform a sculpture of the Great Sphinx and to make it as detailed as possible. You see her actually sitting right over my shoulder there.
Yeah.
And that was a very interesting journey for me, Joe. And I have to say that it was a little bit odd and maybe even a little bit magical in the process of doing this sculpture. And let me share with you just the tiniest little anecdote. As I was doing this sculpture of the Sphinx, you know, first, of course, I did the body, all right? And then I worked on doing the head of the way the head looks now. And then I sculpted a lioness head, right? And so the idea was going to be put the lioness head on the body, hollow out the lioness head, and see if, in fact, all of the things could fit together, kind of like making a chocolate, if you will. And so I'm working on this sculpture. It's late at night. I've got the head, I've got the body, I've got the lioness head, and so forth. And I am looking with the sculptor's hands, okay, because as a sculptor, I think it's important that one is able to see with your hands as well as with your eyes, right? So I'm looking back and forth to see where this head should go, where the head goes.
Can I just ask quickly, what material were you using for this sculpture? Was it?
Well, this is a plastiline sculptor's clay.
Okay.
And it's the beautiful medium for working in because you can get it soft by warming it up and working it, but then it sort of hardens up again when you leave it be, and so that's really the medium of choice for sculpting. So I'm seeing where this head is to be located, and again, my hands are really the ones showing me where the proportional proper spot is for this head to land on the body. Because remember, if the head is extended too far forward or too far upright or whatever, there won't be enough volume inside the head so that the current head would actually fit inside that. So that was the issue that I was dealing with. So I'm finding this location for the head. Finally, the spot appears. My hands determine where the head should actually be located, all right? And so that's fine. Plop the head down there, fix it into place. And then I look over on my iPad where I have all these photos of the Sphinx that I've been studying, making this sculpture and whatnot. And there's this one aerial shot, I think that I sent it along to you. There's this one aerial shot that was taken in 2015. It's kind of a
Is it worth bringing that up?
Sure, absolutely. It's an overhead shot late in the day when the sun is just about to go down. So the light is very, very long on the back of the Sphinx. Lo and behold, I look over at that photograph and there is a mark. There is a hump that is on the back of the Sphinx. That's not quite, there we go. That's the shot.
Yeah.
The hump that is right there on the back of the Sphinx behind the Sphinx's head was in exactly the shape and exactly the position of where I had just located the lioness neck on the back of the Sphinx. And I have to tell you, I saw that and the hair stood up on the back of my neck all the way down my arms. Like, what the heck just happened?
Right. Okay.
Right there is a mark showing exactly where that lioness neck would have been had the head been recarved.
Okay, fascinating.
And so, I thought, well, okay, well, obviously this is common knowledge, right? So I get up the next day and I do little research and look around and so forth online. And not only is it not common knowledge, it has not actually ever been noted before. And I say that it has not been noted. Yes, there are topographic surveys of the Sphinx that accurately show all the layers, of which that is one. By the way, it's labeled Bed 7A by Mark Lehner in his seminal work, Archaeology of an Image. But I got a hold of Manu. I sent him an email and said, hey, I know this is nothing, but I was doing this piece of the Sphinx before we went to Egypt to meet up with Robert Schoch and Manu Seyfzadeh and the entire group that we went with. And I saw this mark right on the back of the Sphinx, like right where the stinking head goes. What's up with that? And he wrote me back immediately and he said, oh my gosh, I think you're onto something. And that really, really is what started my journey with Mehit, the Sphinx, is doing that clay sculpture, seeing that there was actually a mark in reality where I had predicted sculpturally, where I had predicted one would be.
Yeah.
That's really what kind of started that journey.
And I so think this is the image behind. Is this the image of what's behind you?
Yes, that's the image right behind me.
And you can kind of see, exactly what you're saying in terms of sculpting you've got the head on one side and then you've got what we see today embedded inside. But there's more to it than just seeing the two sort of side by side. It's the physics side as well that you're trying to explain.
The physics side of that. And that's why I think that the sculptural rendition of this was such a meaningful contribution to this very, very complicated and broad conversations, because you can really see that. And again, my point as a sculptor remains the same. And that is, if all of those assertions are true, then it had to be able to have been derived at sculpturally. And I believe that I demonstrated that. That is what was really the topic and subject of the first paper that I published in Archaeological Discovery Journal in 2020 called Mehit's Stump. And that is referring to the remnant that is still visible to this day on the back of the Great Sphinx that arguably may have contained the seeds of where a recarved lioness head would have fallen. It's very exciting to have to have been able to be a part of this whole conversation like that.
Sure.
Now, interestingly enough, Joe, I have seen a couple of comments online on YouTube videos and things like that over the last couple of years where people have said, "Oh, well, that's just a silly lump of clay. That proves nothing." Well, it's interesting, and perhaps it's a silly lump of clay, but I must tell you that silly lump of clay is a pebble that I tossed into the still pool of Egyptology, and the ripples of that are spreading far and wide. That image that you just put up there has been viewed almost 10 million times online over various platforms. The Joe Rogan show with Graham Hancock, on numerous podcasts and YouTube videos that people have made, and on
Yeah.
Quora, and it's been cited in several books and so forth. So, silly lump of clay as it may be, that lump of clay has got some legs. Let me tell you.
Yeah, and it's not just this; it's many aspects though about the whole story of Egypt that's making waves and really telling us there's more to this story than we're told. So maybe we can turn to a little bit about the bearded lady, the story there, and also about the pyramid texts.
You bet. Well, so let's frame the question here first. I think it's important to ask, okay, so what? What difference does it make if the head was recarved and maybe the Sphinx is older than we're told and so forth? What difference does that make? You know, first of all, the uninitiated look at the Sphinx and say, well, if it's so much older, how come it looks like an Egyptian? For starters, okay? And the reason it looks like an Egyptian is because the head was recarved in, let us say, 2550 BC, if you will. This is probably the watershed, no pun intended, between Egyptology and the alternate history view of how things happened. Was the Sphinx head recarved or not? The Great Sphinx of Giza is probably the most enduring and perplexing mystery of ancient civilization. And one has to ask, how is it possible that the most colossal and grandest statue on the entire planet is absolutely and utterly without mention in the historical record for over 1,000 years after it was supposedly created? Okay. What's up with that? How can that be? So our work that I've done with Mehit and that I've done in collaboration with Manu Seyfzadeh has been in the service of trying to build a bridge between the convention of Egyptology and the worldview of the alternate historians, and seeking to bring balance and to bring those two together, because there's been a real logjam and a real schism between those two worldviews really for the last 30 years, since John Anthony West first asserted that the Sphinx is far older than we know by maybe even thousands of years, and that it looks like it does because it was recarved. So that's kind of the premise, I think, that it's important to look at this whole conversation in. And in my opinion, the reason that the question of was the Sphinx recarved at a different time, was its head carved in modern dynastic time? I say modern being not ancient, but I think the reason that question is important, Joe, is because the Sphinx represents something that it is footprints that lead backwards in time and not forwards in time, the way that we have always been told. And that the erasure of Mehit, the patron goddess of the archivists and the keepers of the record, if you will, her erasure is a very revealing part of all of our forgotten history. Yeah. So that's kind of the thrust of where I come to this. And where this goes to the bearded lady is because it is our attempt to provide a hieroglyphic textual reference to actually there is a place where the story of the Great Sphinx and her recarving is told. And it is told in the pyramid texts. Now, for your viewers who may or may not be aware, the pyramid texts are in the tomb of King Unas, who is a 4th dynasty king. And he is, his pyramid is probably the last and the smallest of the royal pyramid period of the pyramid builders. It's located in Saqqara. And unlike perhaps some of the other pyramids, his pyramid actually is a tomb. And his tomb is some 97 feet directly beneath his ruined pyramid in the bedrock. And in his tomb, which basically is two pretty good sized rooms, the sarcophagus chamber and the antechamber, and then there's an entryway and the little sort of three-pronged tunnel thing that goes off to the east. In his tomb is where the pyramid texts are. And this is important because the pyramid texts, there's like 26,000 of them, literally from floor to ceiling in these two rooms. I mean, it is astonishing to go in there to see this in person.
And are they still there, or are they
oh
been
my
moved?
God, they are in a perfect state of preservation because they haven't been exposed to sun, to water, to wind, sand, erosion, all of those other kinds of things. It was discovered in like 1881, 1882 by Maspero, who discovered the pyramid texts. But the point being that the pyramid texts are the oldest known religious writings from ancient Egypt. What does that mean? That means that this is the very first time that all of the ancient rituals and the oral traditions and the incantations and the spells to guide the king's spirit to the afterlife, this is the first time in the tomb of Unas that these were actually committed to stone. So I think that's important in terms of contextualizing the pyramid text. Now, mind you, this happened about 150 years after Khafre, okay, who, let us say, allegedly recarved the head of the Sphinx or carved the whole thing or whatever. So 150 years later is when Unas died and when his burial chamber was provided and so forth, and the pyramid texts were installed and inscribed in his tomb. So in the pyramid texts, we find that carefully interwoven into the narrative of the pyramid text, which ostensibly are instructions, spells, rituals, and invocations to train and to guide the spirit of the king into the afterlife, okay? Mm-hmm. That is the official meaning, purpose, and intent of the pyramid text. However, carefully woven in between the lines of that narrative is this story of Mehit, the lioness, mm-hmm. the Great Sphinx, and the incredible sacrilege and defilement and desecration of this venerated ancient monument that occurred under Khafre when he stuck his face on this ancient venerated monument. Okay. So that was kind of the launch pad, if you will, for our investigation when Manu and I went back in 2022. Mm-hmm. And we spent 3 weeks in and out of that tomb, cataloging, photographing, analyzing, compiling the threads of this story that runs through the narrative of the pyramid texts.
Okay. So from your perspective, the lioness head was recarved at the time of Khafre as a form of, would you say, is it sort of punishment or try to banish the knowledge?
Not punishment at all. This was a rebranding in the most historical and grandest perspective, if you will. And in fact, I would go so far, Joe, as to say that this was not just a symbolic rebranding. It was actually a theological seismic event. Let me explain. Mehit, as the guardian of the scribes, the priesthood, the archivist, and who was closely associated with the moon religion or the moon cult. So you've got female lioness moon cult religion, okay, that had been the religion for who knows how long. All of a sudden, a king comes along and says, hey, I am having my face carved into this ancient monument with, may I say, the divine braided royal beard adorning my face. And I am henceforth signaling that the moon cult is no more and that I am associating the Great Sphinx, this monument, with the ideology of kingship and the sun and the sun god Ra going forward. And so this was basically a state ordained change of a religious paradigm that had been in place for countless hundreds of years, if not longer. Okay. So
it makes me think
we
that maybe this idea was borrowed by the Romans when they decided the Council of Nicaea to change religion and from the polytheistic to the monotheistic. Seems like a similar pre-event to that, and it seems this thing's been going on for a while.
Joe.
Yeah,
excellent point.
Yeah.
Those are two great examples of the eye of the needle that history passes through and is changed forever. And you're exactly right to point out that the Council of Nicaea. So this change that happened, this rebranding of Mehit, the lioness, imagine for a moment, if you will, that Mao Zedong in China, okay, or Kim Jong-un in North Korea these days. Imagine if he went out and took some ancient monument that had been revered for centuries by his people and his culture, carved his face into it and said, yo, people, henceforth, I am the living God right here, right now, today. Not in the afterlife, not later on down the road in history, but I am the living God right now. So imagine if that had happened in either one of those environments. Imagine what would happen if you were to say, oh, hey, that's not really Kim Jong-un. That's really the ancient statue of such and such that we believed in forever and ever and was our religious icon. Basically, what would happen is off with your head and off with the head of all of your family and all of your friends and everybody that you know, okay? So the point being that any references to the prior iteration of this statue would have delegitimized the claims of kingship and divine right, if you will, of the king or the ruler or whatever. And I think that we see the workings of that same kind of situation happening here. And again, I have mentioned before, and I firmly believe that the recarving of the Sphinx is not just an archaeological event. It's not just a geological event or an erosion event or a quarrying event or something like that. It is rarely examined as an iconographic event. And that's the horse that I rode in on as a sculptor. Let's talk about the change of symbols and what they mean to the culture and the civilization. And what it ultimately leads to, Joe, is that in order to validate this change from female lioness, moon cult religion to king image, sun god, sun religion, and so forth, in order to validate that, she was extinguished. Her moon cult was extinguished, and Mehit the lioness was expunged from the historical record. And that's one of the contributing factors to why we see no references to the Sphinx for over 1,000 years. And by contrast, I have to say that the iconography or the symbolism, if you will, of the lioness Mehit, who was associated with the moon cult and associated with the Sphinx for all the way back to at least the first dynasty in Egypt, we see that. I got a little, I'm going to hold this up for you here, just up to the camera there.
Oh, yeah.
This is an example of a first dynasty sealing that was in one of the graves, if you will, one of the tombs, where the lioness symbol with the bent rod coming out of her back is clearly displayed right next to symbols of like a shrine and so forth and so on. This iconography of Mehit the Sphinx goes all the way back through at least the first dynasty.
Okay.
And it ends.
Can you bring that back up again? Sorry, I just got a quick question.
It ends with Khafre. Okay.
Okay.
That is the last time that we see the use of the symbol of
Where is Khafre on that?
No, God, this is 500 years or more before Khafre. That's the whole point.
And how come there seems to be two heads and two paws in terms of
Well,
the shape?
the actual Linus
Four
is
paws even.
there, and it's there, and then this one right here, Acre, is the two-headed lion, if you will, that is also an important symbol that is in the pyramid text. And basically, he's the guardian between the nether world and the world of the living, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
As is ultimately one of the functions of the Sphinx is that she is the guardian between the afterlife and the present day life. And in fact, one of the elements of the paper that Manu and I wrote, talking about the story of the Sphinx in the pyramid text, is that the actual architecture of the tomb of Unas is a simulation of the Sphinx's body, through which the king must traverse on his journey to the afterlife. So, I mean, the symbolism is all very, very carefully encoded and very carefully wrapped around in through the entire pyramid text in the tomb of Unas. One of the aspects that, in addition to wordplay, metaphor, simile, and homophony, and all the kinds of things that the scribes used in the hieroglyphics, is also text placement, i.e., the positional location of specific texts in relation to other specific texts is a very important tool for intent and meaning. So and again, not to get too far into the ditch on that just right off the bat, but these are some of the things that became apparent to us when we did this detailed analysis of the pyramid text in the tomb of Unas in February, actually just about a year ago.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah. And what's the significance around the bearded lady and the beard itself? And you mentioned it earlier, but I think I heard a story, I think it was from you, about the woman wearing a beard was a very was against the idea of divinity and the beliefs at the time. Is that right?
well, yes and no. I mean, there were certainly female pharaohs throughout the history
Mm-hmm.
of ancient Egypt, and for a lot of that time, the beard was actually something that was added, that was worn, if you will. It was part of the ceremonial
Mm-hmm.
dress of the king and that kind of thing. However, there's a big distinction when you look back through the ancient reliefs on tombs, the ancient statues that you see, and so forth, that there's different kinds of beards that are depicted. Okay, normally a living king wore a short, square beard. Okay, and the curved, almost like the scorpion tail, the curved braided beard was a symbol that was reserved exclusively, underlined exclusively, for gods and for ascended dead kings. In other words, kings that had ascended to attain their godlike status.
Mm-hmm.
It was the divine royal braided beard was exclusively a symbol of divinity, as distinct from the short beards that female pharaohs and male pharaohs were always shown. A living king had the short square beard. Deceased ascended king had the curved braided divine royal beard. Okay,
Yeah.
So that's where we get into the importance of symbols and iconography.
Yeah.
Imagine, if you will, that when Khafre had his sculptors carve his face into this ancient Linus monument, okay, that's a desecration for one, okay, but with his face adorned as a living king with the divine braided royal beard, that was him proclaiming in the most important and monumental symbol possible, I am the living God. I am not the God in the afterlife later on. I'm the living God right here and right now. That's what I mean when I said that this symbol change from lioness to king's face was not just a stylistic nuance with this beard. It was actually a theological seismic event. And you can imagine that the group that was probably the most impacted also had to be the most careful about their expression of protest and uproar, that being the priesthood, the scribes, and the archivist class. Again, archivist being the keeper of the records, right? Because this was a sacrilege and a defilement, literally, of historic proportions. But you don't think any one of them were going to raise their hand and say, "Oh, by the way, this is a giant sacrilege, and we're throwing a flag on this." Not so much.
I know.
And
sure. Yeah.
and so we see the tale of this is camouflaged and woven into the pyramid text. Again, the first time that the ancient beliefs were inscribed in stone in a royal funerary capacity. The story is there of the outrage expressed, the protest expressed, if you will, through sarcasm and through metaphor and through all sorts of different images that are likened onto the beard and that refer sarcastically to the beard and to the evil deed that has been done. I mean, this is all around through the pyramid text, but beneath the surface, okay? And that's the story that we tell in The Bearded Lady. And we call it The Bearded Lady. I arm wrestled with Manu about the title of that piece. But I felt it was really important to put that concept right up front, Joe. And that is that the real event that happened here is that the king bearded the lioness. And he stuck his own face and said, "I'm a god, you're not a god, you're history. In fact, you're not even history. You just became she who is not mentioned. I'm the god going from here on forward." And the outrage and the protest of the priesthood, scribal class, and the archivists is what is demonstrated throughout the pyramid text and comprises the story of the bearded lady. And frankly, I think that this may be one of the only examples known to date of references and talking about the actual Great Sphinx of Giza and Mehit the lioness, who was its predecessor.
Sure. Turning a bit more to the history before all this happened, what's your views, your take on, I guess, the growing thoughts, and I think Graham Hancock, someone who's been bringing this forward, about ancient civilizations that lived 11,000 years ago, and the talk of the Younger Dryas event that wiped them out, and the rebirth happening in Sumeria and then to Egypt, etc. So what's your take on this kind of new narrative of our history?
Well, first of all, let me say that I absolutely subscribe to that viewpoint. Okay. And I have to say, and not in passing, but I have to say that Robert Schoch and his work in Forgotten Civilizations, his book of 10 years ago, I guess, that was probably really instrumental in leading me to this conversation, because that was the very first narrative that I read that put all of these pieces into a coherent thread, if you will, of how could there have been an ancient civilization? How could it have been erased almost without a trace? How could we have been placed in a situation where we were essentially starting over again and climbing that hill back towards civilization again for not the first time, but for the second, who knows, maybe even more than that.
Fifth or sixth, I think some of the claims are, yeah.
Right, exactly. Yeah. But he was the very first that provided me with a narrative that showed those steps cast against a verifiable geological environment that did not have to invoke gods, magic, the supernatural, aliens, or whatever in order to get from point A to point B where we are now. And so kudos to Robert, his wife Katie, and also to the work of John Anthony West. And really, John is the one who drugged Robert over there, of course, as I'm sure everyone knows, and said, I need a real life geologist to look at this Sphinx and say, what do you think about the notion it's older? And Schoch's response was, he looked at it for 30 seconds and said, of course it's older. The erosion on here is very clear evidence that this all happened during the wetter period of a far, far removed time frame in Egypt and in North Africa than has existed for like the last 5,000 years, let us say. And so, that's kind of what led me along this way. And so, my piece of this puzzle that we're talking about is a microscopic piece of this much broader conversation. And frankly, I think that my work is kind of done on the shoulders of John Anthony West and Robert Schoch and Robert Bauval and of Manu Seyfzadeh, whom it's really been my extreme honor to collaborate with and to be a co-conspirator, if you will, with Manu in moving the football forward on this story that, hey, there was a prior cycle of civilization. They, whoever they were, perished at the end of the last ice age, be it either by the agency of a comet or the agency of a massive solar outburst, whichever, that abruptly and cataclysmically ended the Younger Dryas, where sea levels rose some 350 to 400 feet on a geological time scale, which was almost an instantaneous rise of sea levels, thereby obliterating any evidences of a previous cycle of civilization. Not any evidence, because you sort of see the footprints are evident all around the globe. And that kind of gets me to a point of one of the things that I had said to Manu the very first time I met him, 5 years ago at Contact in the Desert, if you will. I happened to be sitting next to him watching Robert Schoch speak. And, I said to him, Manu, history is like a crime scene. Once you acknowledge that an event may have occurred, all of a sudden, every footprint, every tire track, every fingerprint takes on a forensic significance that you can actually reconstruct a picture from. And that's exactly the scenario we found when we went into the tomb of Unas last year. Yeah. We'd been in there before. Manu's been in there many times before, but the story of one single out-of-date, antiquated, disfigured, and deliberately overcarved hieroglyph of the Mehit, the lioness, with the curved rod coming out of her back. A symbol, like I said, that had gone all the way back to at least the first dynasty. This symbol was right in the center of the wall, of the north wall of the sarcophagus chamber in the tomb of Unas. And we're looking at that thing going like, okay, so is that a screw up? Was that a scribal error? Or was it deliberate and made to look like an error? And if so, how come that was? Why would they have put something like this? That hieroglyph had been out of use for 150 years, okay? So how come it is in such a prominent location right there in the sarcophagus chamber, right where the spirit of the king is supposed to like come out of his sarcophagus on his journey through and up to the stars and so forth? What's up with that? And are there other similar references or clues to Mehit that may be elsewhere in the pyramid text? That is when we started to look at this and say, okay, this is a crime scene. What other details, what other evidence, what other items are they that help to comprise the story? And so that's really what we did for 3 weeks. And the trail of clues is manifest throughout the pyramid text, starting with the very, very beginning that's in the west gable up there at the top. You start to see the references of the beard and of the unnamed lioness and of the face upon a face, and the fact that it is noted as a royal face, and the denotation that it happens in Rostau, which is the ancient name for Giza, and that over at the very end of that gable is the unnamed lioness with the symbol of the scribes right next to it. All of a sudden, all of these clues start to fill in this picture of there is a story of a lioness and that she was defiled, and the object of the sacrilege was this braided beard that adorned the royal face at the ancient Rostau or ancient Giza. So we followed this all the way through, and that is in the paper that we wrote, the Bearded Lady protest, appropriation, and veiled protest in the pyramid text of Giza. Appropriation, as we know, we see everywhere throughout Egypt. That's no news, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, everywhere you look, you see temples, edifices, statues, sculptures, etc. That the next king that came along said, "This is mine. I'm putting my name on it, and from now on forward, it's going to be associated with me." So, okay. I mean, that's nothing new.
So, I guess you subscribe to the idea that the pyramids were built before the time of Khafre. But what do you think the pyramids were built for? You've mentioned quite a few times about tombs, but there's a lot of people who suggest that that's not their true purpose.
I would agree with that.
Yeah.
It is, first of all, let me step back just for 1 second, Joe, and say what a great job you did on your podcast 2 weeks ago, where you had Gary Osborne and Manu Seyfzadeh on.
Thank you.
Not only talking about the Rendlesham incident and the Penistone Code, yes. That Gary is such a
are you quite familiar with that and
magnificent advocate of that. Mm-hmm. But also, as Gary has indicated, its direct connections to the Great Sphinx of Giza and the importance of all that, particularly as it demonstrates that the layout of the entire Giza Plateau clearly it was the function of some sort of master plan that was created first and then actually activated as the pyramids were built. Regardless of what time sequence that they were built in, they obviously subscribe to a master plan and its relation to the Great Sphinx, which of course Gary has extrapolated that all over the globe. God bless him for doing that. And the point being that tying the Great Sphinx to some of these more ancient civilizations and this more ancient footprint that was established in all likelihood before the dynastic Egyptians came along. Okay. Now, that being said, yes, I agree that it would appear certainly that the Great Pyramid in particular, I think a pretty good case could be made for the fact that that was not a tomb. And the technology, of course, there's much speculation, writing and YouTube videos and everything about the amazing technology that was utilized. And how could they possibly have done that? It must have been aliens or magic or whatever, but it probably wasn't 1,000 slaves dragging 75-ton rocks all the way from the Aswan Quarry 500 kilometers away and raising them up 400 feet up into the air, perfectly tuned to each other. So I do subscribe to the notion that there was an ancient cycle of civilization that perished at the end of the Younger Dryas. However, I am not a fan of, and no offense to all of those believers out there, I'm not a fan of the ancient aliens theory, that it had to have been aliens that helped everybody do that. I'm more a fan of the ancient humans theory. And that being that I do quite agree with Graham Hancock on the point that they didn't have cars and cell phones and television and moon landings, okay? They didn't have rocket engines and forges and blast furnaces and all that kind of stuff. I believe that he is absolutely correct. They probably had a different knowledge set, a different knowledge base that was more predicated on utilizing the natural energies that are inherent in our system between the planet and the atmosphere, in terms of vibration and resonance and frequency. And again, I guess I'm probably equally a fan of Nikola Tesla, who was hard on the trail of all of that stuff before he ended up sort of on the, at least for now, the trash bin of history. That Tesla was very much on the case with that.
Oh,
and
yeah.
I mean, we know from modern day physics and quantum physics and so forth that basically all matter is energy, vibration, and resonance. Okay. And that what we perceive as hard matter and whatnot is really just a function of our inadequate and incomplete description of how stuff is put together. Okay. I would submit to you, well, Nikola Tesla was one of the ones that said, oh, there's more energy between the positive of the atmosphere and the negative Earth. There's more energy in that system than all of the energy that humankind has ever used piled up together. And that if somebody had a different knowledge set and a different worldview description, if you will, that allowed them to understand and to harness those energies that are inherent in the system, I think that there is no end of the wonders that they could do, and that we would fail to understand in this day and age, because we are bound by what I would refer to as the Newtonian heat model of how stuff works, right? We use things, we combust things, we burn them or whatever, and it produces heat, which provides energy that allows us to accomplish work. Okay. And, that's been a good vehicle for us, but it locks us into a worldview that says, how could they possibly have had the energy to have had the leverage to have drugged these things and drug them and up ramps or whatever, or with cranes or 10,000 slaves that fit inside like the tunnels in the Serapeum? Excuse me. I've seen and have touched the 100-ton granite boxes in the Serapeum in Saqqara. Okay. And, there's like 1 foot on either side of these boxes to the tunnels that are hewn through the solid bedrock. And it's like, I'm sorry, you ain't getting 100 people or 200 or 500 people clustered around this 100-ton box to get it down underground, in through this tunnel, and set down into its little alcove. I'm sorry, that's just not happening.
I was in Machu Picchu last year, and when I was there, I the every tour guide does the same thing. They show you this picture of people pulling large rocks to build these structures, and I did question it, and I think about half the tour guys I questioned it with were like, there are other theories, and they were open to it, and others were just very close-minded to it. So there is an openness to suggestions that this idea of pulling rocks up ramps is maybe not the correct one. I think that's growing,
or not the complete description.
Let us say. Maybe. I mean, it's just like the pyramids. The time of Khafre, they possibly did build it. They probably mentored it. They probably did work on it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they originated it. Right. So,
well, it's interesting to note, and I think that Graham points it out quite well, and that is the Pyramid of Khufu, the Great Pyramid, if you will, probably represents the zenith of pyramid construction, and that it is the largest by far. It has the most masonry in it, and obviously the highest number of stones and things like that by far of any other pyramid that was made in the pyramid period of dynastic Egypt. And that all the pyramids after that were lesser in scope, lesser in quality, lesser in precision and dynamic use of materials and so forth. For instance, the Pyramid of Unas, where we were in examining the pyramid text, like I said, last and smallest of the royal pyramids. Okay, well, dig, that thing is basically a pile of rubble that is encased in the fine limestone. I sent you a
Yeah,
photo to that effect
yeah,
too.
and
It's so
that's
striking to see. That is
yeah.
so different from the Great Pyramid. And yet that was however many hundreds of years later. So the notion of a civilization with skills that are devolving and getting less and less and less as time goes forward rather than evolving, that ain't right.
No, it doesn't make sense.
That
And
ain't
it's
right.
also, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's also shown in just the simple ceramics and pottery and all the various tools that were used for just cooking and simple things like that. You can see a degradation in the
Yes.
ability to do this, and it kind of blows your mind why, you know?
The devolving. That's right. Exactly. And, it's not just that. I mean, Ben has been on his podcast has been really articulate about the stone vessels that were found, like the 40,000 busted up stone vessels that were obviously much, much older, that were found beneath Dozer's step pyramid
Mhm.
there at Saqqara. And, these vessels are flawlessly, perfectly turned stone vessels out of the hardest materials like diorite and things like
Mhm.
that are so far in excess of what the archaeological record shows as having the tool capacity that was evident in the archaeological record at that period of time. Because remember, one of these things, when you're talking about, gee, they did all these things with these various tools and whatnot, I am always reminded of the fact that you have to lay the timeline of metallurgy along all of this whole description of how and what was done at different points in history and whatnot. Because the history of metallurgy, if nothing else, is a history of different points of civilization's ability to control fire,
Mhm.
right? I mean, copper, you can melt copper basically with a wood fire that you build to pile up the logs, and you can melt copper with that. Okay, that's fine. Okay. You start getting into bronze, and you start getting into iron, and you start getting into steel, and all those kinds of things. All of those are a function of our ability to control and direct fire. Again,
Mhm.
the Newtonian heat principle, if you
Mhm.
will. And so, yes, they didn't have, before they had, the notion that they did all those giant precision cuts in granite from Aswan and things like that by building a fire on it and banging on it with a rock, and tooling all these perfect edges and perfect curves and perfect fits and so forth with copper is not only ludicrous, it's a bit of an insult, I think, to our intelligence. There must have been something else that was in use. Not necessarily a tool, maybe a procedure or a way of doing things that
Well,
allowed them to harness the energy that's out there.
exactly. Yeah, I think if correct me if I'm wrong, but the etymology of pyramid comes from fire in the middle or fire mid. So, and fire doesn't necessarily mean what we were talking about just now about fire, but fire is in the energy inherent in everywhere that they were able to harness in a ways that we seem to have lost in a way that we've kind of not able to harness what is abundant energy all around us at all times.
That's a great point, Joe. And I kind of, in my own thinking, I kind of refer to that as the big fire and the little fire. Okay.
Yeah.
And the little fire is the fire of combustion and
Mhm.
oxidizing some material in order to obtain the heat that you use to perform work with. Okay. The big fire is the incredible, many, many orders of magnitude greater energy that exists in, like, the strong attraction and weak attraction of particles and in the atom, and the electromagnetic forces that are involved and
Mhm.
whatnot. I mean, the amount of energy in just the tiniest substance, if all of that energy is released from at the atomic level, we're talking, hundreds of kilotons of energy as opposed to a ton of
Yes.
TNT. And so that's the big fire and the little fire. And we've been pretty far down the road of the little fire, and we think that that's the only one that really matters.
Mm-hmm.
Silly us.
Well, maybe there's going to be a change to that in years to come, and
we hope so, for
yeah.
sure. And in fact, that's probably what fuels my passion for this notion that there was perhaps an ancient cycle of civilization that had a different way of knowing and a different way of understanding how the world, consciousness, space, energy are all integrated, that allowed them to do things that we find frankly impossible. And yet there they are.
Yeah. So actually, I'll turn our attention maybe to consciousness and this notion. We talked about it earlier. Have you heard of Donald Hoffman and his he kind of was one of the people that I heard first that talked about the notion that consciousness is the base reality. Everything is conscious, and material world is comes from that. And
I'm not familiar with them, but I just from your description there, again, as a sculptor, forgive me, but I resonate with that. For sure.
I definitely resonate with it, and it's something that it kind of changes the kind of this perspective of the nature of reality itself when you kind of switch from thinking of everything as matter floating in the universe that somehow coalesces, and when it gets that into a certain shape, somehow consciousness comes from the interactions, when really consciousness is fundamental, and matter is what's born out of, I guess, on consciousness's need to create a world for experience to find out what consciousness is. It's kind of there's quite a depth to why the matter exists, why we exist, why there are things.
Indeed. Let me refer to a recent film that I loved. In fact, we bought it and I've seen it several times, and that is Arrival. Perhaps you've seen that movie. Yeah. Okay. And in that movie, Arrival, which of course is the story of they bring in this young gal who is a linguist after this shiny silver ship arrives and nobody knows what to make of it. And she basically comes in there and establishes a platform for seeking to communicate with them, if you will. And in that movie, there is a really nice conversation about what is called the Whorfian hypothesis. And that was Benjamin Whorf, who was a linguist and a semanticist and wrote some very seminal works on how language comprises our worldview and how that determines, if you will, via our collective consciousness, how that determines the reality that we experience. Okay, that's kind of a real simplistic nutshell of the Whorfian hypothesis. Okay, and the reason I mention that is because one of the things that is really key to that movie, Arrival, is that the aliens, if you will, they teach humans that time is a continuous thing and not a sequential, slice, like it's a continual thing that exists in both directions at all times. And it is basically our language and our description of the worldview that has determined the reality that we collectively experience as humans, that time is unidirectional, it only flows that way and has a beginning and an end and so forth. And it is that awareness in the movie Arrival that I think ultimately would lead humans to the stars. And not to put too fine a point on it, but I get back to that's probably one of the things that drives my passion, Joe, for this whole subject and this whole conversation is the notion that it is our blindness imposed by our worldview that is keeping us planet bound and that is keeping us constrained within Einstein's framework of the limits of the speed of light and so forth and so on. We ain't getting nowhere at the speed of light. Okay. I mean, we're not sitting around for 5.6 years just to get to Alpha Centauri or Proxima Centauri or whatever. And everybody knows that you got to have a wormhole if you're going to have a star drive.
Mhm.
Okay. And I guess what I'm here to say to you is that part of the thing that drives my passion in this ancient civilization is that I believe that they knew things that we need to figure out. And they knew stuff that we need to know. And again, back to the crime scene thing. Okay. They're a crime scene and there's stuff going on there. And once we acknowledge that that happened, we'll figure it out.
Yeah.
That's the important thing,
I
is
think,
getting to the point where we acknowledge that there is
yeah.
something to figure out about that.
Yeah. Our only limits really is our imagination in terms of looking
It is
forward.
our arrogance that makes us blind. That's what I'm here to tell you. And that is so true across so many fields, but especially when it comes to this notion of, was there a prior cycle? Because we're all up in our drawers about how we are a king of the hill, and this is the highest aspirations that Homo sapiens have ever achieved, and that we're the top of the heap, and God bless us for our ownership of the world and everything in it, and all the creatures, great and small, and all the resources are all ours to use as we see fit because we're top of the heap. That's a blindness that we impose on ourselves. And it's kind of what keeps us locked into the unproductive spiral that perhaps we find ourselves in.
Yeah, it's all connected, definitely. And Graham Hancock's one of the famous phrases he seems to have coined is that we're a species in amnesia. And
so true.
Yeah, it seems true. But do you sometimes feel maybe that the way we are in terms of our amnesia was not an accident, but maybe was quite a deliberate from certain forces, and maybe this chimes into the potential for extraterrestrial influence?
Well, yes. I mean, it is certainly a possibility that it is intentional. I am a firm believer in the fact that the word coincidence, may I say, has a hyphen in it. And it is actually coincidence.
Yeah.
And the difference is significant, okay? Because a coincidence referred to things that aren't related at all, but just happen to happen at the same time. However, a coincidence is actually indicates that things, of course, are related. If they're present in the system, they are related, even if the connection may not be obvious to the uneducated viewer, if you will. And I believe that to be very much the case. However, that being said, of course, I grew up watching Star Trek, as everyone did. And so I note that the principle of non-intervention, I think that I salute that principle, i.e.
the prime directive.
The prime directive, correct.
Yeah.
Whether they come from the far future or from a far distant star, it seems to me that if a civilization or species is to mature enough to achieve citizenship in, let us say, a galactic society, you kind of have to do that on your own as a self-selecting population. They can't come and say, here's the phaser, here's the star drive, here's the anti-gravity device, and off you go to the races. I mean, it's kind of like giving the gun, the keys, and the dynamite to the teenagers and say, we're off to Bermuda, you guys party on while we're gone, and we'll see you in 3 weeks. That ain't right. Okay. Yeah. So to your point of, is our amnesia intentional or not? The outcome is the same. We are amnesiac, and it's going to be up to us to pierce that veil of our obscured history. And all of these works, and frankly, that I think that ultimately, I believe, is one of the meaningful contributions to the alternative history field, if you will, is to help bring that conversation into the campfire of the public conversation so that people start
Excuse me.
saying, okay, well, what if
Yeah.
such and such? I think that's really where knowledge, insight, disclosure, and revelation will occur, is in that context.
Yeah. Are you following the kind of, I guess, the path to disclosure, you might call it, from the 2017 in the New York Times article about the Nimitz, and how things have developed since then, with more podcasts, more people talking about it, less stigma when referring to the potential. Have you been following that closely over the last few years?
Yes, of course I am, and I must observe, Joe, that I am the child of a military family. Okay, and so I spent my life growing up all over the world. We moved every 2 years or whatever, and my old man was an aviator from the days. His career as an aviator incredibly spanned all the way from wood and canvas biplanes to multi-engine jets, and being present on launches to the moon and so forth and so on during his career as an aviator. So,
yeah, I was going to ask you about that, actually.
Yeah, so I'm very hip to that. But here's the real point: as an aviator in the Air Force, I am very sensitive to the notion of how military pilots were not about to go out blabbing on CNN or MSNBC or whatever that, hey, I saw a UFO last week when I was flying in my F-16. It flew right past me and stopped and then hovered and then made a right turn and then zipped off and disappeared and whatnot. You don't do that as a military pilot, because you get grounded, and then you ain't flying, and then you're flying a desk if you're still in the service. And so, to your point about the Nimitz, okay, and all of the activities that surrounded that, the pot started to bubble over. It was no longer possible just to keep the constraints on people saying, hey, I saw this, or whoa, maybe I saw that, or you know what, I also saw this. All of a sudden, the forensic evidence is starting to mount to where even our government is obliged to come forth. Not that they would ever not tell us exactly what's going on, right? We would not presume ever that would happen. But in the outside chance that they might be keeping some things from us for our own good, I believe that we've seen that, and that is the information block, if you will, that is crumbling. And I'm so thrilled to see that. I mean, everywhere you go now, the concept of talking about sightings and the presence of these unexplained aerial phenomenon is now a part of everyday conversation on Main Street. And it's no longer just the repository of kooks and weirdos. So I salute that all day long. And, I mean, every time you look into a UFO related gathering, like, for instance, Contact in the Desert, the common thread is, oh my God, disclosure is coming. Disclosure is going to happen this year. It's going to happen in August, or it's going to happen in October, or whatever. And that's been going on for a while. But I believe that point has gotten some legs, and that we are getting closer and closer to where we will have an unambiguous indication of some other intelligence other than ours. That doesn't mean that they're going to land on the lawn of the White House, okay? Or that, Anderson Cooper is going to get an exclusive interview with the aliens in their bubble suits and things. That doesn't mean that. But for starters, I think it is enough for us to derive an unambiguous indication of some other intelligence other than us living here on the surface of the planet. And again, back to the Rendlesham incident and the Penniston Code, okay? Gary has done such a magnificent job of following that painstaking and complicated story and nursing that thread out to see that it actually has connections with our world and with the fine structure constant.
Yeah, I mean, that was...
exactly, that didn't even exist when that happened. And I think that it is not too far-fetched to. I like his conclusion that it was not a manned or an occupied vehicle that was at the Rendlesham incident, that it was in all likelihood a drone or a probe. These days, of course, we're all about drones and probes, and we use them all over the place all the stinking time, right? So no big deal. And frankly, the notion that it could be an extratemporal event rather than extraterrestrial, I think that that's a legit premise, and good on him for chasing that down.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating, and I'm just eager to see how this all develops over the years, and I'm glad to see it all being talked about.
So I was raised on space, okay, and aviation, and frankly, I was raised on the whole concept of flying saucers and science fiction and the whole thing. The question that I have, and you ask about UFOs and how I feel about that and whatnot, is, first of all, I would be the first to agree that we are almost certainly not alone in the cosmos, okay? And that B, there is quite likely that that it's possible that there are travelers from distant star systems or whatever that would come here, that would be observed in our atmosphere and so forth. My question, though, is, did they just start coming like in 1945, 47, Roswell? Did they just start coming? I mean, some would say we started seeing those and the Foo Fighters and whatnot really concurrent with the first setting off of an atomic and nuclear device. And that's when we first started seeing them. I mean, in a sense, that could be kind of a signal of, well, okay, humankind has achieved the atomic energy threshold, if you will. Okay. So did they just start coming then, and we're only seeing them now more because they are here and everybody's got a cell phone with a camera? Or did they come long ago, plant their seeds or do whatever they did, and now they've come back? Or did they come long ago, and have they been here all along?
Yeah.
In their undersea locations or their wherever, whatever. To me, that's kind of the questions that I would seek to thresh out in my own thinking about, let us say, these unidentified aerial phenomenon.
Yeah. It is fascinating, but my view, they have been here all the time, but for whatever reason, well, actually, we probably have a good speculation of the reason why it's become more frequent for us to discuss it or see things since possibly Roswell, maybe before, but that was down to us being able to harness the energy of the atomic weapon and become a threat to them. I think when we're all just barbarically sort of killing each other in various wars with muskets, it's probably okay and let them carry on being humans. But when we start harnessing power that could be a threat to them, I think it became apparent they need to get involved. And it's 70 years later that we are maybe consciously at a point where we might be able to break through this veil and discover more about reality and ourselves. Yeah.
I love the story of Arthur C. Clarke, his short story called The Sentinel. I don't know if you're familiar with it or not. It was a short story, but The Sentinel is the story that the movie 2001 was predicated on, with the monolith. Okay. And that being that the seeders, if you will, that seeded the stars with on all these planetary systems and whatnot, and they put an object that you had to get to a certain level of development technologically and civilization wise in order to access this bell, if you will. And that bell was a monolith that was on the moon, right? This was Arthur C. Clarke's short story. And it was a self-selecting test, if you will, that weeded out the ones that weren't going to make it and the ones that did make it. Because if you found that monolith on the moon, it meant that you'd survived long enough as a species and a civilization to get to the point where you launched a rocket to the moon and actually found the thing. I love that story and the notion of a threshold, a bell that you got to ring. in order to recognize that you have gotten, and the ones that didn't, they fell by the wayside, right?
Yeah.
Civilizations the same way. If they got to a certain point and rang that certain bell, that they were sort of self-selectors as the successful, if you will, rather than the unsuccessful.
Yeah, and then that ties in quite nicely with the fine structure constant, which Gary
Absolutely.
puts as a
Quite to the
yeah,
point.
exactly. The
Quite to the
number of
point.
decimal places gives you a kind of an indication of where you are
Yep.
in
But
your.
back to your remark, Joe, about you believing that they've been here all along, which I'm perfectly willing to entertain that description. But I would have to ask you, in that context, did they or did they not observe the prime directive that we referred to about in Star Trek, i.e., the non-intervention in a species and artificially bumping along their journey along the evolutionary path? What say you?
Well, I think when we say they, we're not talking about one. We're talking about many multitude of species, and I think whatever's going on out there can be just as chaotic as it is here. And the idea that you can control every species to, adopt the prime directive and stick to it 100% is probably just as difficult to maintain law and order in a city. There's going to be someone who's going to break it or try and break it or
It
grey
might
the
be more of
edges.
a
And
guideline than a
yeah,
law, huh? Is what you're
yeah.
saying.
Yeah, and maybe there are some species who try and grey the edges, look at the blur the edges, what it is, that's just to try and find
Indeed.
ways of tinkering with reality whilst not quite breaking it. And yeah, it's probably just as complicated the politics going on out there that it is here right now. And imagine it's not implausible anyway that despite such prime directives that we are I guess, the product of possibly an intervention that wasn't planned. I mean, looking back,
Mm-hmm.
there was primates on this planet, and suddenly, in what a very short space of time, the art and chemistry and music and all these things seems to have become agriculture, and they seem to be part of society in a very short space of time from sort of hunter-gatherer society. And the idea that was born out of just pure evolution is something that needs to be questioned, because I think
Absolutely needs to be
I think
questioned.
the
And
idea of
and
intervention seems quite plausible when you see the rate that happened in our history.
well, and our history is full of unexplained or inexplicable bumps along the way of how is it that such and such happened at that point in time? How could that,
Mm.
and Gobekli Tepe and Kerhan Tepe and all of the tepes that they are now finding all throughout
Yeah.
Turkey are indicative of a vastly more organized and integrated society than any of our models of the, farming came first, agriculture came first and was followed by religion and then was followed by civilization and so forth. That's been our description of the process for a long, long time. And Gobekli Tepe shot that thing full of holes. And in fact, it really gave a lot of credence to the notion that actually religion came first, and that was followed by sedentarianism or by agriculture and farming and settling down and so forth and so
Okay.
on. And that the divine experience, the embracing of a consciousness and a something out of body and greater than ourselves, that experience, be it aided or not by psychotropic substances, if you will, that experience seems to go all the way back to caveman days
Mm-hmm.
as virtually an uninterrupted tradition. Again, getting back to your earlier point that consciousness arguably precedes the formation of things and
Mm-hmm.
matter and so forth. I think, there's probably the most exciting thing about the times that we live in right now, Joe, is that we are increasingly getting to the threshold of finding out how much we don't know. That's really exciting, rather
Yeah.
than thinking that we're all full of ourselves and that we know everything. Like,
Yeah, and the
God bless
hubris to
them.
say we're just
Oh,
about
the
there,
hubris. I
in
mean, we
terms of
all
physics.
remember the stories in 1895 when Congress basically was all set to shut down the patent office, right? Because everything had been invented and everything was already known that we needed to know at the end of the 19th century. And we clearly recognize how much of a blinder hubris is. And I think that awareness at least helps to arm us to try and not be hubris and not to allow that to guide our vision of who we are, where we came from, and where we're going to.
Exactly.
I think that's the challenge that we need to free ourselves of.
Yeah, and I think that path of discovery is probably infinite. It probably never
For
ends.
sure.
Yeah, yeah, and
Absolutely.
if because if it did end, where would you go then? I think this it's deliberately infinite. There's always
Well,
something to discover. There's always more.
unless you go through the torrid meteor stream trail again and get smacked back down to stone
I
knives and
guess, yeah,
bearskins again, which,
yeah,
stranger things have happened, have they not?
yeah. Okay, so I think it's been a wonderful talk. I wouldn't mind quickly actually showing your this Free the Linus website that you said that's recently gone live.
Excellent. It actually
Yeah,
just went live yesterday. I encourage everyone to take a peek at it. It is freethelioness.com.
yeah,
And it is a great spread of some of our work and the corpus of work about the Sphinx in terms of the recarving of it and the trail of it and the trail of that story through the pyramid text, and sort of a snapshot of how, what, and where that piece is and the role that that piece plays in this broader conversation of us discovering and pulling back the veil on our obscured, amnesiac, and forgotten history. For sure. Freethelioness.com. Remember, it's our hubris that is keeping her trapped. Okay.
yeah.
So freethelioness.com. I encourage your viewers and your listeners to go and check it out. And Joe, in closing, I would like to share this thought with you. It's as if Sir Elton John so hauntingly portrayed in his song Candle in the Wind, except that Marilyn Monroe is not the candle. Princess Diana is not the candle. The candle is civilization, and the flame is knowledge. It is so easily extinguished, and it is so hard to relight. That's really kind of the image that every time I hear that song, I realize we're the candle, and our knowledge is so easily extinguished. I'm reminded of Archimedes, who was killed on the sword blade of a Roman centurion in the sack of Syracuse in like 235 BC. And all of the knowledge, all of the wisdom, all of the incredible ingenuity, and all of the potential contributions to civilization expired with him on the sword blade of a Roman centurion. And it wouldn't be many of the things that he discovered and the principles that he articulated wouldn't be rediscovered for another 1,500 years after that. That's how easily the candle is extinguished.
Yeah. Well, there's a very good point, and I think it's a very good way to end this conversation. So thank you very much,
Let's
Rob,
keep
for
that
your
flame
time.
lit, you guys.
Yeah,
Keep it lit.
exactly. Talk about it and bring it up in conversations and discover more. So yeah, thank you very much, and maybe we'll speak again another time.
And Joe,
Yeah.
thank you so much for the chance to visit with you about the story of Mehit, the lioness, and her alter ego, the Great Sphinx of Giza. Thank you all, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you.